This is episode 157. As the title suggests, we are going to talk about red wolves. And more specifically, we are going to try to answer the question, is the red wolf a real species? Our guest is Peter Brewitt from the University of California, Santa Cruz, who is a co-author of an excellent paper titled Red Wolf Science and Identity Storylines in an Online Discursive Community. Very timely title. We all taking part of one or the other type of online discursive community. By the way, Peter currently works in the University of Cumbria, and I gotta admit, I take red wolf over any other dog in the world. There are reasons for that, and while we talk about red wolves, there's impossible to talk about them without talking about all the other canid species, especially canid species in North America, all the subspecies of wolves and coyotes and maybe subspecies of coyotes, and the whole discussion about conservation and recovery projects of red wolves. And while we talk about all those things, we also going to touch on environmental history, restoration of degraded landscapes, interpretation of scientific research, the role of science in society. And by the end, we try to answer a question whether red wolves are as good as done, or maybe there's a chance for them as a species if they are indeed a real species. And before we go, big thanks to Steve Carver from the Wildland Research Institute, who put me in touch with Peter. So without Steve, that episode wouldn't be possible. And if you're interested in the red wolves, you'll find many links for further reading in my newsletter. So subscribe to my newsletter. I always provide additional links and additional materials to expand knowledge on the subjects we talk about in the podcast. So the link is in the description of the show, newsletter.tommysoutdoors.com. And in the description of the show also, there is a link to the paper that I mentioned earlier that Peter co-authored. And that's it for this introduction. And now, is the red wolf a real species? Peter, welcome to the show. It's a great pleasure to have you, and thank you for your efforts for connecting, because we had a little bit of a technical problems before that. I'm really excited to have you here and talk about. Well, really, it feels like it's gonna be two parts of the show, right? One, we're gonna talk about red wolf, which I need to admit is probably my favorite species of canids for various reasons, and then is from that we're gonna talk about your excellent research that you made. I actually printed out paper and I go as far as highlighting stuff in it. So that was it. So Peter, welcome to Tommy's Outdoors.
Thanks a lot. I'm really glad to be here. Eager to get into this stuff.
Excellent. Maybe we can start with introduction to red wolf. Red wolf as a species, if it is a species, because that's a part of a controversy. Is it even a species?
Yeah.
And I was thinking, like, how do you even approach this subject? But I'm sure you've done it more than once. So I'm gonna leave it up to you. Please enlighten us. What is red wolf?
Yeah. Well, so the first thing that I think that most of your listeners are probably based in Europe or the UK, or Ireland, which is Europe. Not too many people even in the US know the red wolf was historically the large canid predator of the southeastern United States. The scientific name is Canis rufus, and a big adult would be about 80 pounds, so that's 35 kilos. And they lived, it's thought, from about the state of Texas, so kind of the middle of the South, over to Florida, and then up to about where New York City is now. That's the basic idea of what a red wolf is. It's they look, if you're imagining a wolf that's got a little bit more of a ruddy or brown color, that's about accurate. Although the gray wolf that most people are familiar with, Canis lupus, is typically bigger and grayer.
Why is the controversy with that it is even a species? Like I heard you speak about the red wolf, and I heard you speak about the paper that we're gonna get into in a while, and you posted a picture of red wolf, and I was like, oh, it's a red wolf. It was like, I don't know why, but it was like clear to me. Like, so where that controversy even comes about, right? Because at some point they were declared extinct in the wild, I think in the 1980.
Yeah, 1980. Well, the controversy comes when you get down to it from the fact that when Europeans arrived in what's now the United States, they really only knew one kind of wild dog, wild canid. So anything that looked kind of like that was called a wolf. That was the word that they had for it. But what we've come to realize that there were a variety of wild canids living in North America, still living in North America, and they're different from each other. But and this is where the problem lies. Not so different as to really be that distinct. There was red wolves in the southeast. There's the gray wolf, again, the one that is familiar to pretty much everybody who's going to be listening to this show, in the west. And then in the northeast, there is an animal that most recently is called Canis lycaon. I might be mispronouncing that. That seems to have been a native to North America before gray wolves arrived across the Bering Land Bridge. So they had one wolf in mind, and they found a continent that had three-ish. The other thing that is more difficult even than that is there's also the coyote, Canis latrans, which is historically kind of a medium-sized animal, 40 pounds, maybe, 18 or 20 kilos. And they lived mostly in kind of the middle and western part of the continent. So there was this kind of what's been called a canid soup. And understanding that and deciding what is part of the problem. Because, and this is the second part, they can produce fertile offspring with each other. They challenge the idea of a species concept that most people are familiar with.
Even with gray wolves.
Yeah, I can't think offhand of a specific case where a gray wolf and a red wolf interbred, but it certainly seems like gray wolves and the kind of northeastern wolf that lives in eastern Canada now, and red wolves and domestic dogs, don't forget them, and coyotes can breed with each other and again produce fertile offspring. So this gets into a much bigger topic that we could maybe get into, which is the idea of hybridization. We learn about animals, as children, as this is a horse and this is a donkey and this is a cow and so on, and a lot of the time that works pretty well. But it turns out that a lot of animals can breed with each other, and that's an important part of evolution. And when we make policy, and when we make the social animal, so to speak, the idea of what an animal is to us in our imaginations and in our society, our culture, we don't have a lot of room for those kind of blurry edges. Then the question becomes, in the case of a red wolf, where should we draw our lines? Is this a really distinct species, or is it similar enough to coyotes or something like that that we should think of them as one thing?
They're much bigger than coyote. Well, not much, but they are bigger.
Yeah. I mean, that's so either they're bigger and they lived in a different area, so we should call them different things. Or from the other perspective, maybe just we should think of coyotes as a more kind of diverse, morphologically diverse, the body. When I say morphology, I mean what the body looks like, animal than we had previously thought. Maybe coyotes lived across a lot of North America, and just the ones that lived in the Southeast were bigger. There's enough sharing of DNA, and I'm not a geneticist, so I can't get into this in a lot of specific detail, but that there's enough similarity there that some taxonomists will argue that we should think of these as one animal, and some will say that we should think of them as several. So it really gets down to what we want to call a species, how we want to define a species.
And do you know, like, in terms of, because there were like a DNA research done on it as well, and then so they don't have like a, so to speak, coyote DNA, but they're like similar parts of it? Like, do you have it? Like, if you can elaborate on that a little bit, because there's like this term of ancestral mitochondrial DNA.
To the best of my understanding, they do have some coyote DNA, but the question is, well, two questions. One, how much should that matter? I mean, we have Neanderthal DNA. I mean, I do. Almost anybody with European ancestry does, but it doesn't make us Neanderthals. The other question is when that coyote DNA made its way into the population. It's one of the going theories is that as red wolves are persecuted, as every other big predator in North America or in the United States, what's not the United States, was, that pressure led to interbreeding with coyotes perhaps relatively recently, or maybe it was always there and they just shared genes over the course of history. So yeah, it's a case of are they genetically distinct enough, and is their role in the landscape and the way that they look distinct enough that we can call them their own species? And to quickly get back to when you asked about where the controversy comes from, I'd say that the issue there is that we make policy based on an individual species being endangered or not. And if we decide that we're going to call this a red wolf and say that it's its own species, then it's extremely endangered. Only a handful of individuals in the wild now. As you say, it was extinct in the wild as of 1980, and an animal that gets a lot of legal protection. On the one hand, if you're going to say that, no, it's just another larger kind of coyote. Coyotes are hyper common and considered by many, many, many people to be a pest. And you'll find them in every state except Hawaii. Wouldn't be that surprised if they made their way to Hawaii.
I was going to say that.
No, there's one swimming there right now. So whether we call it a species or not changes its legal status and then changes the way that people can act with it. Can you hunt it? Can you get in trouble for hunting it? What it is to us legally depends on whether we say it's one species or not.
Yeah, exactly. And then also that what is funny is that all that construct, like you pointed out, we have this kind of like a somewhat artificial construct, and then it's like, okay, if the DNA of a coyote gets into the red wolf after the European contact, then that's not a species. But if the coyote DNA get in there, in a little ice age, like some of the I think researchers think that it might be as old as in the little ice age. Then this is a species, right? And then you got to ask the question, like, what is the difference? What the difference does it make where the goddamn DNA get into the animal? It's there, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then one of the big issues surrounding all of this is that then to go back a little bit, after they went extinct in the wild, they were reintroduced in the eastern part of North Carolina in 1987. One of the first successful reintroductions of a big carnivore, and eventually some of those animals bred with coyotes. So should the pups be protected or not? And what does it mean if we allow this to happen? An interesting context here, since we're talking about North American canids, is that as wolves of pretty much no matter which one of the species or what you call them, as wolves disappeared from the United States, or most of the United States and much of Canada, coyotes, which again had been a relatively small canid that lived in the Great Plains and the western mountains and deserts, expanded to places that it hadn't been seen before. I'm from New Hampshire in the Northeast, and when I was a kid in the 1980s, they were considered to be kind of a newcomer, and people would be like, "Oh, we heard coyotes the other night." Whereas if you lived in Colorado, then you hear coyotes every night. So we have these animals now expanding across the continent, but also acting and even looking different from their ancestors, evolutionarily, very, very recently. Eastern coyotes, sometimes they get called eastern coyotes, and there's an argument that we're seeing the rapid emergence of a new species. Eastern coyotes have picked up a certain amount of dog and even in southern Canada, some wolf DNA, and are filling a niche that is a little closer to the large carnivores in the east. And how do we decide to think about that? And does it matter in terms of red wolf conservation that we now have an animal that's not exactly a red wolf, maybe, but a lot like it present on the landscape?
It's truly this canid soup. They all kind of interbreed with each other, and that like you said, that probably doesn't pose many problems for the animals themselves, but for the policymakers who needs to try to categorize this and say like this is like a absolute nightmare. Here I say it.
Yeah.
Peter, tell me, so is the persecution of coyotes and canids in the United States play into that story? Is it important part of the story? And if so, if you could, for the benefits of the listeners and viewers, like just say a few words about how would that whole, bizarre and horrifying story unfolding there.
In the lower 48 United States, much like in a lot of Europe, large predators were persecuted as a matter of culture and as a matter of policy, both in order to try to stop predation on livestock and so on, but also really as to some extent as a cultural priority. These were villains. And I mean, everybody in the broadly Western European and beyond context knows the fairy tales about the big bad wolf and so on, but the same kind of thing applied to brown bears and pumas in the Americas and lots of other predators. So eventually we created, I say we, Americans, created almost a continental scale absence of big predators. I'm in England right now, and the same thing is true on these islands. There's
most of Europe at some point.
Yeah. It's still true here. As a matter of policy, this is successful. As a matter of ecology, it brought a lot of its own problems. So the red wolves were subject to this, just like gray wolves would have been. And eventually, the population of red wolves dwindled down to a little remnant in the bayous, the wetlands on the border between Texas and Louisiana. But by the time this happened, so here we're talking about kind of the 1960s, people's attitudes, or a lot of people's attitudes toward predators had changed. And they decided, when I say they, I mean the government, but also the people who lobbied for change in wildlife policy, decided to catch all the red wolves that they could and try to put them into a captive breeding program, boost the population, and figure out a way that they could then be restored to their native habitat in a way that would be successful. So that's what happened. They caught, I've seen various numbers, but one of the ones that you see a fair amount is about 17 red wolves. So those, in addition to whatever individuals were in zoos and so on, were put into a breeding program, and eventually, after a lot of interesting kind of ecological experimentation, figuring out, if you put them in a cage and then open up the cage somewhere, will they go out? Will they thrive in this place? Will they mate? Will they have pups? Does it work to take a wolf that's maybe lived or been, or even was born in a zoo and then try to make it a wild wolf again? So they had some release programs on some islands.
And this is you're referring to this guy Curtis Curley, I think.
Yeah, so it was one of the. I mean, there were a lot of people who were involved in this from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a variety of NGOs. What usually called charities in the UK.
Yeah, I had if that's the one, I have a fun data on this thing. So
yeah,
I think that there was 50 animals in the captivity, and they only found one that deemed to be pure, and they trapped 400, and out of 400, 43 was recognized as pure, 17 was selected for breeding, 3 were unable to have pups, so it was 14 out of 450. And the thing, they were trying to say whether they pure or not based on the whole morphology profile, not even DNA.
Yeah.
Gee, man. I was reading that. I was like,
yeah, and this is one of the things that is coming back to bite us. Now, the tools of genetics were not nearly as strong in the 70s and 80s as they are now. I mean that's been a part of science that's just exploded, of course. So yeah, morphology was about what they had to go on. How big is the individual? What shape is its? Is its skull? If you look at a red wolf, like an undisputed red wolf, you'll see that the head is different looking than a coyote's, and make decisions based on that. And that was the best that they had at that time. But now, when we expect genetic evidence for decisions like this, it's difficult to go back and justify it because they don't have that evidence, and they didn't at the time. Yeah, another kind of interesting sidebar here is that some of those red wolf genes stayed out in the canid population in the southeast, of course, and just relatively recently they found a group of wild canids. I don't know if there's a good label for them, on Galveston Island, which is in Texas, near the city of Houston, kind of. That turned out to have a meaningful amount of red wolf DNA. So that's in play out there now. Anyway, while all this was happening, the coyote expansion was occurring, and coyotes. And this is an animal that's well known. I mean, there's a cartoon character, Wile E. Coyote, who gets outwitted in the cartoon by the Roadrunner, but in real life is very difficult to outwit. They're very plastic. They can adapt to many different kinds of climate, kinds of setting. They eat lots of different things. They're relatively omnivorous compared to their larger canid brethren. They're basically impossible to eradicate if that's your goal, unless you have an island or a fenced property or something like that. I remember reading that coyotes are aware of how many other coyotes there are near them, and if there's fewer of them, we'll have more pups. So coyotes arrived, and across much of the United States, always, as long as there's been a United States, and this is true in the West, but it's true in the East too, are considered to be a pest, a villain, an animal that's not welcome. Now, there are plenty of people who like coyotes as well, but there are a lot who don't like them. So in South Carolina, where I live now, I work at a place called Wofford College. I got to get that out there. A great liberal arts school in Spartanburg, South Carolina. In South Carolina, there's a policy trying to encourage people to shoot as many coyotes as they can. There's what they call a golden ticket, where they collar some number of coyotes, and if you get one of the special coyotes, then you get, I think it's a free hunting license for life. I should check on that. So as part of an effort to get people to shoot more coyotes. Now, as you can get into whether I think this is good or not, but I would say that as policy, it'll result in a lot of dead coyotes, but probably not a landscape that doesn't have them. So now, the red wolf's scheduled to return in 1987, and with the coyote tide approaching, they picked Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, which is, as it says on the tin, a national wildlife refuge. So owned by the government, publicly owned, operated by the Fish and Wildlife Service, in the extreme east of North Carolina, where it's a big peninsula called the Albemarle Peninsula that reaches out into the Atlantic Ocean. This site was picked for a variety of reasons. One of them was because it was far from the coyote tide. It was kind of as far east as you can go. So the hope was that they would reestablish there and be able to fend off coyotes when they arrived. The other thing is there's very, very little livestock farming. That's obviously a source of conflict with a lot of predators. And it's not, there may be some people who have chickens and so on, but it's not really an important part of the economy or the culture in the Albemarle Peninsula. So they put the red wolves there, and it was controversial, as you might expect. People who don't like wolves didn't like that.
They still didn't like wolves.
Oh, it's easy to think of environmental history in some ways as the environment was good, and then it got harmed, and then we've tried to fix it, and now we like it better. but that's too simplistic. All the different attitudes that have been present on the landscape far into the past are still out there. There's some people like wolves now, but a lot of people still don't like them. And I think it's fair to say though that most people, wolves are not a relevant part of their lives, but and they don't really care one way or the other. But in a democracy, in a free society, the people who do care a lot about any issue are the ones who drive that issue and make it happen. So wolf defenders and wolf critics are the ones who are really important in deciding what happens. Anyway, the wolves were pretty successful there for about 15 years. They pioneered a variety of techniques of trying to boost populations in a reintroduction program. They figured out that you could take pups from a zoo and put them in a den with a wild mother, and she would rear them, so you could get more genetic diversity into the population that way. And the population went up to about 120 or 130 by 2006 or so. So it was considered to be a success. And those are the terms in which I heard about it. And I, like a lot of people, when I got interested in the environment as a child, wolves are one of the things that you know about that have, this cachet, this presence to them in your imagination. And so I, as I was thinking about what kind of projects I'd want to do after I moved to South Carolina, I thought it'd be interesting to look into red wolves. But as it turned out, right when I got to South Carolina in 2014, the red wolf population started to decline.
Oh.
And yeah, it dropped pretty precipitously. The wolves died for a variety of reasons, but the biggest one was bullets. And part of the problem here is that coyotes were on the landscape now. And in North Carolina, you could shoot coyotes whenever you want, pretty much. And that's true in a variety of states. Coyotes are a species where there's really no limit to.
When you were talking about when they were released at the time when there was no coyotes.
Yeah,
back then, and you said like fend off, but fend off, it was like an idea of people who released them. I heard that they had an idea to create like a buffer, like a canid-free buffer.
Yeah.
To protect the red wolves they're released.
Yeah, eventually. I mean, part of the hope was that the red wolves would establish territories and be, they're bigger and stronger than at least the typical coyote, and would then be able to exclude them. But what started happening was that if one wolf in a mated pair would get shot or hit by a car or something like that, the bereaved wolf would sometimes mate with a coyote that happened to be around. So how to deal with that? The Fish and Wildlife Service tried to make kind of a sterilized coyote buffer strip so to make sure that the coyotes couldn't mix their DNA with the red wolves. But it's the kind of thing that needs a lot of management, which gets to one of the big questions in any kind of ecological restoration, which is at what point do you decide that it's restored enough that humans cannot be involved in managing toward a goal, or do you accept that people will always have to be part of it? And what's your end game? So that effort went along, and some people thought that it worked well, and some people thought that it didn't work well. But as this was going, the red wolves kept dropping, and eventually there were only a handful left in eastern North Carolina. A big flashpoint of this, and this is where I decided what I was going to do my research on. It came when, in response to a lawsuit by some environmental groups, the coyote hunting rules in eastern North Carolina were changed and made it so that I think that the decision was that you couldn't hunt coyotes at night, or use some other techniques so that people wouldn't basically shoot red wolves thinking they were coyotes. And if you see a small red wolf at night and you're intending to hunt coyotes, you could very honestly think it's a coyote and shoot it. There's been some suggestion that there's an undercurrent of poaching. This is a convenient excuse, but each individual situation is its own thing. Anyway, so that was 2014, and as I was looking into coyotes at the time, I saw an article with an airplane dragging a banner, and in a picture above this article, and the banner said, "Google Red Wolf Restoration Scandal." So I did, And what I found was a website, a hunting and fishing website, where one of the threads was people discussing the red wolf issue. And that was one of the best ways to learn about, for me, the perspectives people had on red wolves and how they matter.
Yeah, that's and like you said, the controversy are driven about this discussion, and we talk about this in more detail, like, are they pure, are they not pure? Because even in this program, I think they order to kill, or like they say, destroy all the animals in the zoos that were deemed to be not pure because there was something like that, and then they released them. And I think then they figure out that they missed, after 2 generations, they missed one pair of the ones that were not pure, and now, okay, we have all these restored animals, so supposed to kill all of them now. So I think we have a pretty clear picture of what it looks like, what a red wolf is, and what it is or what it isn't, how the situation look like. And now we switching gears a little bit, and we going to that paper. And as always in those cases, folks, I'm gonna link the paper in the show notes. And also, those of you who are not subscribed to my newsletter, subscribe to the newsletter. There's gonna be ton more of links and stuff about red wolf in there. So let's talk now about this world or thing that you uncovered when you get into the the discussion.
So the study that I eventually ended up doing, while my student Lawson Giles and I have to mention Lawson, he worked really hard on this, was looking at the red wolf restoration scandal thread. And the reason behind this is, so what I in my research, I study the political and social parts of ecological restoration, because when you get down to it, I think whether to restore a degraded landscape or not, and how to do it and why to do it, depends on what people want. If people want a certain kind of nature, then they're going to try for that. And if they don't, then it's probably not going to happen. So in the case of red wolves, I thought, what do people want? How do people understand the situation? And then how does that play out in the landscape? And as I got to learn that red wolves were maybe not a species, or what were they? What comes in there is basically science. If you really want to get down to it and argue that something is a species or is not a species, then you need the tools of a geneticist to define it. Most people aren't geneticists, but at the same time, people are affected by the animals on their landscape. They are inspired in positive or negative or ways, or both, and it's a part of their life, even if they don't have the expertise to really answer the question with great authority. So how people understand science and look at science and scientists then becomes a political issue. And this is true with any environmental topic. I mean, the climate change is the most obvious one, but anything that's got any controversy to it, you're going to have people who are not scientists, but are experts in their own lives, but don't have the skills and knowledge to really do their original research, still debating it. So we thought, how do the people in this thread understand the role of science here? And part of the reason that we looked at the thread is it turned out that the thread was a very influential forum for red wolf restoration critics. It's the 21st century, and people get together online, and when they do this, we found that on the thread, people were connecting to each other. They were planning political action. They were sharing information about red wolves, about the state of research, about what was happening in the program on the ground. Then they'd say, there's going to be a hearing about this policy in this town. I'm planning to go. Do you want to go? Sometimes actual policymakers or people from the environmental charities would join the thread to share and talk about the thing. Despite just being on a little hunting and fishing website for the state of North Carolina that had almost 1 million views.
Was that a pretty one-sided thread? So was that like 90%, shoot the bastards, and the rest, or how does it?
Well, it it was decidedly opposed to the Red Wolf Restoration Project. That's fair to say. But I have to say that the discourse was not really, in favoring killing all of them or anything like that. It was passionate, but for the most part, pretty even in tone and kind of hoping to win politically more. Yeah, you can see some wild stuff on internet conversations, but this was a little more kind of calm and professional and clear-eyed than that. I would say, partly I think because some people use their own names, refer to knowing each other in real life, so there's a little more accountability maybe than if it was just all strangers. Anyway, yeah, it was a place where people who were critical of Red Wolf Restoration could get together. And sometimes people who disagreed with them would come on and they would debate about it, and that would develop the conversation. So I thought, okay, if this is the place to understand opposition to the Red Wolf, how do they understand the science of it? So Lawson and I went through and found all the mentions of science in this. I had a gigantic PDF of the thread. All the mentions of science in this multi-year. By the time we were looking at it, it was I think 6 years worth of comments. Yeah, that was the thing. It started out in 2013 or 14 and was still active as of the early 2020s. So in some ways more of like a debating club than just a place where people blow off steam. So we looked and we thought, okay, if the issue is whether it's a species, and then what that means politically. And to understand species, you have to understand genetics. Then how does that play out in this political space? So what we found was that pretty people, when they would mention science, they agreed with science. They were in favor of science. They liked it, but they found that to them, science had been kind of corrupted. They wanted to see peer-reviewed science. They felt that was really the gold standard. But the kind of science that the management or applied science that people like Fish and Wildlife Service biologists or people involved in breeding programs at zoos, they felt that was not legitimate science, generally speaking, and the purity of and the authority of science was then damaged by this.
Was that an element of if it agrees with my points of view, that's a true science, and if it's not aligned with my point of view, that's garbage science or pseudoscience?
Yeah, I mean, people wouldn't say it that way. Hardly anybody admits that their point of view is what it is. But I would guess, not knowing any of the individuals involved, but I think it's fair to say that is likely to have happened. If you go in with a preference, and this is true for people in lots of settings, then you're more likely to agree with things that fit your preference. And again, like we've been talking about, this is not like something like climate change denial, where there's just overwhelming scientific consensus in one direction, and disagreeing with it is like thinking that there's some sort of a big conspiracy. There really is debate in the science, but that debate created and facilitated the discourse, the storyline that the red wolf's not a real species, because again, most people aren't scientists. You have to come up with what you think without the kind of complexity that a professional would be able to put into it. So we get storylines, and this is what Lawson and I identified, that kind of crystallize the issue and become, how you define the issue in a debate. And you'll find storylines about any complex thing. If you ask somebody on the street, so again, I'm in England right now, if you ask somebody on the street what they think about Brexit, Brexit is an enormously complicated thing, but they'll probably give you a matter of a few sentences about, here's what Brexit is about to me. Those are their storylines. They're probably not economists, most people, or political scientists or politicians, but it has meaning to them. So yeah, the storylines that we found were, that science is good and right, but that it's being skewed somehow. That science really, they thought, says that red wolves are not a real animal, They shared and upheld some of the papers that support that point of view.
Were those papers supporting that point of view, very clearly straight up, or whereas because what I find is that often people are saying, "Oh, read this paper, it tells this."
Yeah.
And then when you read the paper says like, "Okay, we took this sample and we done this, and this is what we found out within the context of this sample," and so on. And then it turns out that people who are waving this paper as proving their point, they're actually often over-interpreting what the actual paper was saying. Was that the same case there?
To some extent, I'd say so. So there's a paper that identified red wolves as being about 3/4 coyote and 1/4 gray wolf. Now, and then a legit paper. But then, if you're another geneticist, you'd look at exactly like you're saying. You'd look at their methodology and their sample size, and say that their conclusions are legitimate and they're not making anything up. They've done the right thing, but the way that they've looked at it means that we should understand that in this context. But yeah, while there was more engagement with kind of technical stuff and peer-reviewed papers than most lay people are likely to give, so that was something that I was struck by reading this thread. I think it's fair to say that especially the people who came through and viewed it or maybe commented a time or two but weren't that active, that they look at it and they would take that big takeaway and that would be what they learned about it. So yeah, I think that's fair. Now, again, I can't speak for all the individuals involved, but all those million views were probably not then people who went off and read all the literature, but they were people who got to see this crystallization of the research.
It's especially like you say about these storylines. I found this like a very, very good analogy. I never thought about this in the terms of the storylines, and actually, it was a thread that I spoke about quite a lot recently about how even non-scientific points of view are getting a lot of traction, and a lot of people start to believing them because they're wrapped in this emotional story. And then when that is confronted with like a dry facts and data, well, this is the data and this is like a bell curve and this is the then that doesn't carry any emotional load, and people like when the emotions are confronted with numbers, the emotion is going to win every single time. So I think that was very, very good point on it.
People are emotional creatures, and we are we're storytelling creatures. There's a concept called Homo narrans, the storytelling ape, and that argues that that's something that distinguishes people, and that people make sense of their world by making stories around it. Which I totally agree with that perspective. People see things as a story. Like if you ask people about almost any important issue, is your kid's school a good school and why? They'll start telling you a story about why they think it is or not or what. So yeah, being able to make a story about it and have it resonate is pretty effective. And so then the next storyline became, okay, so if science says the red wolf's not a real animal, and all the scientists who work for the government or work for environmental groups or who do this work, they're scientists. They know that. They must know that. If that's what the science says, then these are the people who actually know. So what's happening? And then this raised the storyline that red wolves are a conspiracy. That there is a conspiracy of pro red wolf groups, motivated depending on whose perspective this was, motivated by emotion or money or the desire for control, and thus putting this false animal that they thought was a false animal out onto the landscape. And in this, it joined the conspiracy theories that you'll find in many parts of American politics, and really, I would suggest every human society has some idea about this, that there's more going on than we know. So this, and they applied this thinking to their sense of the role of science and what they thought of as the twisting or corruption of science in red wolf reintroduction.
Were you guys taking part in that thread, or you were kind of completely only observers?
No, just observers. I mean, I didn't. Aside from anything else, by the time we got into it, the thread wasn't as active anymore. There was still some conversation, but the situation had somewhat subsided. There were hardly any red wolves left on the landscape, first of all. But as a researcher, I don't want to affect the data that I'm finding. And if I went there and asked people about it, that's a different method, first of all. But then I would be, to some degree, guiding what I found. So we left the thread as it was and took it that way.
Do you think that this sort of online settings are effective for those type of difficult conversations? Is like the overall, whether overall it is a good thing that a lot of people can meet in this virtual space and exchange the ideas and talk about those things? Or do you think that overall it is, only ground of spreading those sort of narratives or stories that are really hard to, check?
Is the internet a good thing? That's, I would, when you get down to it, I would say yes. I think it's a good thing. Now, it's more than a good thing or a bad thing. It seems to me that online discourse is a powerful thing that can add a lot of energy and a lot of speed to almost any issue. But I think that, and maybe this is just as I was growing up, the internet was seen as being like a hopeful prospect that it'll allow us to know more and connect more. And I still think that. Now, that's not to downplay a lot of the negative things that are associated with the internet, but for example, this kind of the thread, a lot of the people who are on there know more about conservation, have thought more about it, may hold the same views that they would have and take the same political actions perhaps that they would have anyway, but it served to move things along. So whether or not the Red Wolf Restoration Scandal thread was good for the Red Wolf or a good thing in and of itself, I can't really say. But I think that spaces like it overall are good, that they allow you to see more knowledge and perspective. It's a case of you have to be a critical consumer, I think, of those perspectives and of that knowledge.
I'm curious of your opinion on, let's call it, the interface between the science and policy. I don't want to, bias your answer. I heard many opinions on that, but I think that is also, that question is relevant in the light of your research, because there was an impact on policy.
Yeah, I mean the people on the thread were politically active and were moved by these storylines and brought them to the political arena. The role of science and policy is, there's a lot of research about this, because you very obviously need science in order to make well-informed policy on, almost anything, the medical issues, pollution, and so on. But politicians and administrative agencies have to make a decision to do something. They vote for a law or they don't. You decide to reintroduce a red wolf or you don't. You have to do something where when the data may not be that clear. So in the face of scientific uncertainty, a decision still has to be made. And that's one of the things that's really difficult about it is you may have science where the researcher is not confident enough to advocate for a course of action, but not doing anything is also a course of action. So this is one of the big challenges, really, of the role of science in society. And again, in a free society, people are affected by that science. This is not about the environment, but the thing that's probably in everybody's mind here is COVID, and everybody had to make their own decision, and governments had to make their decisions based on science that was evolving and controversial and do something or not.
A lot of people, they think like the science is like this final thing that tells ultimate truth. Like, this is a science. It's like, no, this is you have a paper, and then the same people, you're like, oh no, actually we were wrong, or something.
Yeah, I'd say that the thing with science is that it's dynamic. It's supposed to be. Science is intended to continue to study issues, to ask questions and answer them the best way they can. So I think that we have to understand that science is not final, but it's for these questions, it's the best that we have. If you have to make a decision on conservation, then understanding the science is necessary. But you have to realize that it may be wrong. But even though it may be wrong, whatever the science. If there's a scientific consensus, then that's your best bet.
I like this expression. I think this is from the US, that the policy is made based on best available science.
Yeah, exactly.
Encapsulates the concept, like this is the best we have at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, so you have to, again, you have to be a mix of proactive and humble, I think, which is difficult. You should be critical and think a lot and do your best to be well informed, but realize that for most people, you can't know the things like the genetic makeup of a red wolf in any technical sense. So, and that gets back to, in the 70s and 80s, as the red wolf program was going underway, the morphological approach was the best that they had, and they shouldn't have done anything else given the tools that they had available. But we can look back at that and think differently about it now.
Is there anything else in the paper, or like you would like to talk to us about the paper or your research?
Well, I would say that we human beings have to decide how we're going to live with other species, what other species we're going to share spaces with, whether it's your pet at home or whether it's the landscape, big scale in which you live, and then in what terms are we going to relate to those species? So a lot of people are accustomed to having a landscape with no predators or no significant predators, no big predators. We now see that this has ecological consequences in terms of things like overpopulation of deer, which is something I've heard a lot about since arriving in the UK. And that doesn't even get into some of the more cultural or moral issues that people will raise about allowing things to go extinct. And a lot of people have a powerful sense that that's wrong, or think that predators are good, not. So how will we reach a position of comfort, I guess, or at least acceptance of other species, and which ones? In Eastern North America, we are in the process of trying to figure out how to live with predators around. At least eastern coyotes, and I haven't mentioned them because they're omnivores, but black bears are more abundant in a lot of places than they used to be. Alligators in the southeast are more or less constant presence in a lot of coastal communities. We have to decide, and sometimes maybe change, and that's difficult.
We started with red wolf, and I want to close it with red wolf as well. So what is the current situation of red wolf? Are there, I way too often asking the question about the, species name, and then are they done? Are they as good as done? Or is there a hope?
Well, really depends on what you're hoping for. The current situation with red wolves. So this is where politics comes in. If you have an administration that's sympathetic to red wolves, then you'll have Fish and Wildlife Service and so on that's going to be more sympathetic as well. I think it's fair to say that I'm not sure if Joe Biden himself has opinions on the matter, but that the Biden administration has been more supportive of the red wolf program than the Trump administration was. So the numbers have ticked up a little bit. There's some more activity in trying to boost the red wolf population in Eastern North Carolina than there was in 2018, 19. Having said that, and this is my opinion, I don't see how the red wolves will establish sustainably in the face of political opposition and the coyotes on the landscape. I don't know if we'll keep kind of a stronghold of them and that'll be that. I don't think that I don't see a scenario where they can expand out into the rest of the landscape and become the predator in Eastern North Carolina and beyond again. I think that the eastern coyote is going to be the dominant predator in that part of the world for the foreseeable future. Maybe there'll be a little group of red wolves, and maybe they'll even find some other places to put them, but I don't think that they'll displace coyotes.
Look, I always finish with the question along the lines, if you had a magic wand, right, what would you do for red wolf and whatever? But I feel like this is a even more tricky question than usually, because like if you had a magic wand and just dump a lot of purebred red wolf, they would go out and hybridize with goddamn coyotes anyway.
Well, if you had it, this is one of the things that's really an interesting question. If you had enough of them, then there's a good argument that they would establish packs that would exclude coyotes. I'm not sure that there are going to be enough of them in a broad enough landscape to do that. If I had a magic wand, I think I would make it so that we'd had a larger pool of unquestioned red wolves, that the red wolf species identity was harder to dispute and simpler to understand, and that they were able to establish themselves as a predator that more or less dominated the landscape rather than being under pressure from the swarm of coyotes. So I don't know how many that would be, but I think that would make for probably a better ecological outcome, and certainly a simpler one.
Thanks for that. I'm gathering that this is there is still a little bit of a hope with about those red wolves, but we really don't know what's gonna happen.
It's hard to say what the future holds. There may be some version of the wolf back on the landscape, but we'll see. It's a very dynamic situation. One other thing I'd have to note is that political receptivity, not just by politicians, but by regular people, matters a lot as well. If people really want wolves, then they will support management and that allows for that. And that's true in any place that has wolves, not just North Carolina. So the human target, I think, if you're trying to support some outcome, is the key.
Peter, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Oh, it's been fun. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please leave me 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. This is great help for me and for the podcast. And while you're already there, don't forget to subscribe to my newsletter. The link is in the description of the show.